Okay, so this week we are in Genesis chapter 12. Up until this point, Genesis 1 through 11 was a quick progression. In those 11 chapters, we saw 2,000 years of history. So, very quick. Moving forward, we're going to slow down a lot, especially here in the book of Genesis. The next 14 chapters are going to focus on Abraham and his life as the first patriarch here in the story. And it will begin the same way that the Bible begun, the creation account begun, and that is God spoke. So verses 1 through 3 says, "Now the Lord had said unto Abram, Get thee out of thy country, and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, unto a land that I will show thee. And I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee, and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. And I will bless them that bless thee, and curse them that curseth thee, and in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed." And I forgot to change these scriptures as I was reading. So the Lord said unto Abraham, at the moment that verse 1 picks up here, Abram is currently in Haran, which is located in modern-day Turkey. Though Abram is receiving a call here verbally, the New Testament does reveal to us that Abram had earlier received the call while he was still in Ur. We read this in Acts chapter 7, verses 2 to 4. And he said, "Men, brethren, and fathers, hearken. The God of glory appeared unto our father Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia, before he dwelt in Haran. And said unto him, Get thee out of thy country, and from thy kindred, and come into the land which I shall shew thee. Then he came out of the land of the Chaldeans, and dwelt in Haran, and from thence, when his father was dead, he removed him into this land, wherein ye now dwell." Now, when God called Abraham, he was pretty well in age. He was advanced, especially for what we consider advanced today. And I would say that Abraham was settled in his ways. His ways were firmly rooted in him by now. Abram was a thoroughly pagan worshiper. He worshipped idols. His father was an idol maker and had sold idols. And we read of this idol worship of Abraham's family in Joshua 24:2. "Joshua said unto all the people, Thus saith the Lord God of Israel, Your fathers dwelt on the other side of the flood in old time, even Terah, the father of Abraham, and the father of Nahor, and they served other gods." So God says to Abraham, "Get thee out of thy country." Now this is followed up with two additional leave commands. He is told to leave his kindred and his father's house. He is called to leave behind everything he knows or has. He is to leave his home, the land, his kindred, which is his extended relatives, and his father's home, which is his close relatives. The command which quickly progresses here from leave your country, leave your land, to leave your father's home, leave your relatives, draws attention to the cost associated with obedience to the Lord. And we talked about this, I think, not this last Sunday, but the Sunday before, in our sermon, the price of discipleship, the cost of, count the cost. And he says to go to a land that I will show you. Now the command rests in the faith of Abram to obey God without a knowledge of all the details. To follow God is to trust that he knows all, and to obey without knowing the details yourself. Abram was to follow without knowing where he was heading, until he had arrived there. We're told this in Hebrews 11 verse 8. By faith Abraham, when he was called to go out into a place which he would receive for an inheritance, obeyed, and he went out, not knowing whither he went. So verse 1 is the command. Verse 1 is what Abraham shall do. Verses 2 and 3 are the promises. This is what God will do, and what God will do far outweighs what Abram will do. He says that I will make you a great nation. The first of many blessings is a great nation. And now true greatness only comes through the blessing of God, only comes when God does it. And now this promise is really great in context of Sarah's barrenness. I remember in chapter 11 last week that Sarah was barren. She had no children. The greater part of Abram's account will follow the plot of getting the land and receiving the child through which he would become this great nation. God says, I will bless thee. The second promise is blessing imparted from the Lord to Abraham in one of these ways. He says, I will make your name great. Now this is kind of ironic in light of chapter 11. Last chapter we read the Tower of Babel. And remember, the people gathered in the Babylonian plan and said, let us make a name for ourselves. Now they attempted to make their name great. Well, here God will make his name great. And again, true greatness of our name or of our family, nation only comes when the Lord performs that work. We alone cannot make our name great. In fact, in the Old Testament, there are only 3 names that were said to be great throughout the entire Old Testament. Abraham's name is said to be great. King David's name is said to be great. And most importantly, God's name was said to be great. Now, the greatness of man's name, and this is important, whether it's Abraham we're talking about, or David, or any other person, it is only great to the extent that it points to the Lord. And if our life or our name points to the Lord, then it's not we that are great, but it's the Lord we point to who is great. Now, since God's name alone is truly great, making Abram's name to be great symbolizes this adoption of Abram by God. By the way, in the Old Testament, Abraham is the only person said to be God's friend. That's unique. And then he says to Abraham that you will be a blessing. In being blessed, Abraham would be a blessing to others. This is expanded upon here in verse 3. For he says, I will bless them that bless thee. So by extension, Abraham is a blessing to all who bless him. And more appropriately, God will bless those that bless him. And then he says, I will curse him that curses you. Now the phrase here, curse him that curseth thee, this is unusual in its statement. What is more common that we expect to see is blessed is he that blesses and cursed is he that curseth. But instead, this is a different form of saying it. God is saying, I will step in personally on your behalf. I'll be your shield. Those who curse you, I will personally curse on your behalf. Those who bless you, I will personally bless on your behalf. God's saying, I'm going to step in and I'm going to do this. And then he says, in these shall all families of the earth be blessed. So this is probably the greatest of the statements to Abram. Through him, the Lord is going to be born. It was through Abraham's line, and then further through the line of David, that Jesus was born. And through Jesus, all families of the earth can receive blessings. So, as we continue in the passage, we're going to read verses 4 through 9 and see the story of his call progress a little bit more. So Abram departed as the Lord had spoken unto him, and Lot went with him. And Abram was 75 years old when he departed out of Haran. And Abram took Sarah his wife, and Lot his brother's son, and all their substance that they had gathered, and the souls that they had gotten in Haran. And they went forth to go into the land of Canaan. and into the land of Canaan they came. And I just realized I am not moving this again. And Abram passed through the land unto the place of Shechem, unto the plain of Moreh, and the Canaanite was then in the land. And the Lord appeared unto Abram and said, Unto thy seed will I give this land. And there builded he an altar unto the Lord, who appeared unto him. And he removed from thence unto a mountain on the east of Bethel, and pitched his tent, having Bethel on the west, and Hai on the east. And there he builded an altar unto the Lord, and called upon the name of the Lord. And Abram journeyed, going on still, toward the south. So, Abram departed. Verse 4 here is a partial fulfillment of the command given in verse 1. In verse 1, Abram is commanded to leave his father's house, leave his kindred. However, instead of doing that, it says that Lot went with him. Abram had failed to fully depart from his father's house. Rather than departing everything, leaving it behind, Abram took with him some of his close family, namely Lot. In the next chapter, next week, Abram and Lot will separate. They'll depart, and that will fulfill this command in full, and God will then reiterate the promise. Now, to ensure that we understand the importance here that Lot came with Abram, we will see that mentioned once again. And Abram was 75 years old when he departed Haran. They didn't have cars back then. They walked everywhere. Could you imagine at 75 years old walking as far as Abram walked? I can't imagine it now, and I'm not that old. So, there has been much controversy over the age of Abram, or more particular his father's age when he was born. Some commentators believe that Abram departed Haran 60 years before his father died. Now, if this is the case, it would make Abram Terah's firstborn. And this does deal with the objection we talked about last week to Terah giving birth at 130 years old to Abram. But we can't read it this way. If we look to the scripture, it is clear that Abram was the last born, and he left Haran after his father died, when he was 75 years old. We see this in Acts 7:4. Then came he out of the land of the Chaldeans, and dwelt in Haran, and from thence, when his father was dead, he removed him into this land wherein ye now dwell. So we see that Abram did not leave Haran until Terah had died, and he left at 75. So we take Terah's age at death minus 75 years old that Abram was, and we know how old he was when Abraham was born. And Abram took with him Sarah, his wife. She left as well, not knowing where they went. So this isn't just for husbands. You know, the husband is the spiritual leader in the home, but the wife submits to the husband as the husband submits to Christ. He took Lot, his brother's son, in verse 5. This is indicated once more here. And this also sets up for the later chapters that Lot plays a role in. And then it says, all their substance they had gathered. Abraham was successful. He was blessed by the Lord and had acquired property, mostly livestock. And then it says the souls they had gotten in Haran. Abraham had acquired souls or people, and it's preferable to interpret this as servants, slaves. However, some commentators do suggest that these souls are people Abraham preached the Lord to, who had converted and followed with him. I don't see that as preferable. I don't see that as the way this reads. That is an option, though, that was presented. And they went forth to go into the land of Canaan, and into the land of Canaan they came. The author is stating that they went and made it, and this is in contrast, in comparison to Terah, his father, who did leave Ur to go to Canaan, but he never made it there. He settled in Haran, and in Haran he died. And that was intentional. God did not want Abram going to the promised land with his family. He wanted him to separate. And then Abram passed through the land unto the place of Sichem. Sichem is the first stop mentioned here on his journey. And the land should be understood when it says through the land is through Canaan. He traveled through the promised land unto the plain of Moreh. Now Moreh is believed to have gained its name from soothsaying, and likely indicates the presence of a Canaanite shrine, and if so, would foreshadow things to come, that God revealed his presence and allocated the land to his servant Abram. And the Canaanite was then in the land. This is here placed by the author to describe why Abram could not take immediate possession of the land. It was already occupied. And here, in this place, the Lord appeared to Abram. This is the first record of the Lord appearing to a patriarch in the Bible, in the Old Testament. Now, in what form this Christophany occurs, it's not mentioned. We don't know if it was in a dream, if it was in a vision, by way of Christ taking on the form of a person. We only know that it occurred. And when this occurs, he says unto him, unto thy seed will I give this land. Now this is a promise of seed and of land. Though the land would be his inheritance, he himself would not receive it. Instead, it would be given later on to his descendants, about 430 years later. This is, again, significant in relation to Sarah's barrenness. And there he built an altar unto the Lord. His response to the appearance and to the promise here of both descendants and land is build an altar and worship. Although it's not specifically mentioned, the worship likely includes sacrifice. And the building of the altar mirrors Noah, who built an altar to God in response, getting off the ark and receiving the promises that God made in the Noahic covenant. After which he moved to a mountain to the east of Bethel, with Bethel on the west and Hiah on the east. This just gives us a generalized, rough location of where he settled and pitched his tent. This is the first time we're told that he pitched his tent, and we can assume everywhere he went he pitched his tent. The reason for mentioning it here is to indicate to us that Abraham had a prolonged stay in this location. He stayed there longer than usual. He built an altar here to the Lord and called upon the name of the Lord. This tells us he engaged in regular, formal worship while he was there. The worship accompanied by an altar also likely included animal sacrifice to the Lord. And Abram journeyed, going on still toward the south. Abram continued moving southward through the land. This is really describing Abram as traveling from one end of the region to the other in Canaan. This is describing Abram symbolically taking possession of the land. He's staying in several locations. He's worshiping throughout. He is symbolically taking it in, inheriting it. So, we're going to finish this chapter off with verses 10 through 20. We're going to read that whole chunk. And there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down into Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was grievous in the land. And it came to pass, when he was come near to enter into Egypt, that he said unto Sarah his wife, Behold, now I know that thou art a fair woman to look upon. Therefore it shall come to pass, when the Egyptians shall see thee, that they shall say, This is his wife, and they will kill me. But they will save thee alive. Say, I pray thee, thou art my sister, that it may be well with me for thy sake, and my soul shall live because of thee. And it came to pass that, when Abram was come into Egypt, the Egyptians beheld the woman, that she was very fair. The princes also of Pharaoh saw her, and commended her before Pharaoh, and the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. And he entreated Abram well for her sake, and he had sheep and oxen, and he-asses, and men servants, and maid servants, and she-asses, and camels. And the Lord plagued Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarah, Abram's wife. And Pharaoh called Abram and said, What is this thou hast done unto me? Why did thou not tell me she was thy wife? Why sayest thou, She is my sister, so I might have taken her to me to wife? Now therefore behold thy wife, take her, and go thy way. And Pharaoh commanded his men concerning him, and they sent him away, and his wife, and all that he had. A lot going on here. So there's famine in the land. It says that this famine is grievous in the land. So this is mentioned twice in one verse. And the intention here appears to show that Abram took no other consideration other than the famine in his decision-making process. And then he went down into Egypt to sojourn there. Abram determined to go to Egypt temporarily and wait out the famine. Now, famine had caused, we see this especially in Genesis, several of the patriarchs to go into Egypt. It was a famine that drove Israel to Egypt, where they had become enslaved and stayed for 430 years. Now, where Abram acted in faith when he went to Canaan, he acted outside of faith going to Egypt. Abram seemed to consider everything here except for God and the decision-making. Now, famines in the Canaan region were very common, and they consistently threatened food supplies until the invention of more modern irrigation, until they can bring water from elsewhere to the land. The rainfall there was not consistent enough for growing crops. But Egypt was a constant refuge because the Nile River provided constant and steady supply of food. There, the Egyptians have ancient documents that actually document migrants traveling to Egypt due to famine. Now, when he came near to enter into Egypt, this first scene takes place on the border of Egypt, where Abram and Sarah, they talk and come up with this plan. Now, none of Sarah's thoughts are recorded here, so we can only assume that she consented with Abram on this plan. He says, I know that thou art a fair woman to look upon. Abram is concerned that Sarah is beautiful. Now, some people speculate that Abram is exaggerating her beauty because she is 65 years old. But we must remember first, beauty is often interpreted different by different cultures. So we should not assume her beauty or the exaggeration of her beauty based on what we interpret as beautiful. And second, we also have to remember that she lived longer than 120 years. Right now, she's only halfway through her life. So we can actually assume she's retained much of her beauty of her youth, her natural beauty. He says, they will say this is his wife and will kill me, but they will save you alive. Now, this is actually a legitimate fear if you don't have God on your side. It was common for the husband, as foreigners traveled, for the husband to be killed so that the locals could take the wife. So he's concerned here for his life, that they would take her. He says, I pray thee, thou art my sister, and my soul shall live because of thee. Abram's plan is to call Sarah his sister. And in doing so, they would treat him well. Now, it's unclear exactly what his expectation is, what he expects to get out of it. The way this would work is if he gave Sarah off, if he married her off to somebody else. And it doesn't seem likely that Abraham would do that. What I think Abram's plan is, I'm making a guess here, is that by saying she was his sister, he could bargain with her and ask for unreasonable gains, therefore never actually committing her to marriage, but also saving his own life. Now, we've also seen other accounts in the Bible where brothers would try and stall their sister's wedding. We've seen this with Laban and Rebekah, Dinah, and her brothers as well. And while the lie was technically true, Sarah is his sister, he only told half the truth in an attempt to conceal the other truth. And when confronted with the lie later on, his reaction that follows, it shows that he understood he made a bold-faced lie. He didn't make a white lie. He boldly lied, and he made no attempt to justify it. And then verse 14, I find this interesting. The Egyptians beheld the woman that she was very fair. Where Abram described her as beautiful, the Egyptians said she's very beautiful. The princess also of Pharaoh commended her before Pharaoh. Abram's plan almost worked. All others who saw her, they had a bargain and he could stay them off. He could be unreasonable. But when word of Sarah's beauty reached Pharaoh, Abram dealt with somebody who had no need to bargain. Pharaoh was wealthy. And then the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. The context suggests that Pharaoh took Sarah to wife. Now this phrase taken in is used elsewhere in the Bible to take one as your wife without consecrating the marriage. So it is unclear here in this passage whether Pharaoh merely took her to wife or if he committed adultery with sexual acts. The passage doesn't say one way or the other, but we'll see in verse 17 maybe a hint of what happened. But verse 16, he entreated Abram well for her sake. Abram was treated well for Sarah. It was customary for the party of the groom to give great and expensive gifts to the bride's family. In this case, these gifts included sheep and oxen, he asses, men servants, maid servants, she asses, and camels. Really what we're reading here is Abram had all of a sudden become extremely wealthy from this arrangement. And then verse 17 gives us a hint, possibly, at what happened. The Lord plagued Pharaoh and his house with great plagues. This suggests that Pharaoh did commit adultery with Sarah. Plagues in the Bible have typically been reserved for dealing with great and severe sin. However, this could also just be divine intervention to prevent the adultery from taking place, a warning to Pharaoh. So it still doesn't say one way or the other. We have to kind of read into that a little bit and not know.
Well, if Sarah stayed in Egypt, how would the seed of Abram get the land? She had to be with Abram in the end.
Yeah. That doesn't mean that adultery didn't happen, but we don't know. But what does happen, though, is these plagues are brought, and Pharaoh calls to Abram. More correctly, the text says Pharaoh summoned Abram. This was urgent. This wasn't just a call him up casually. Pharaoh is angry and summons his presence. And he says, "What is this that thou hast done?" This actually mirrors closely the question that God asked Eve when they ate the fruit. Pharaoh is actually genuinely surprised here by this revelation of deception. He says, "Why didn't you tell me she's your wife? Why did you say she's my sister?" His question just continues. But notice the silence of Abraham throughout this. Abraham never speaks up. He never justifies it. Abram knows that he's guilty. He says, "So I may have taken her to me to wife." He admits his desire to make him his wife. However, it stops right there. He doesn't say that I did take her to wife. He says that I might. So, once again, the question of any sexual relationship, it's kind of vague. The text stops short of actually saying what happened there. But Pharaoh says, "Therefore, behold thy wife, take her, and go." This is interesting. Abraham originally feared that he would die, he would be killed because of his relationship in marriage here. And then his lie had caused somebody to either cause adultery or come close to causing adultery. And even in Egypt, adultery was frowned upon. It actually was a capital offense. It deserved the death penalty. So he feared the death penalty. He feared death for being married to her, and then committed an act that warranted the death penalty. So the fact that Pharaoh allowed Abraham to leave should be recognized as a blessing. In fact, Pharaoh indirectly recognizes the protection of God upon Abraham and takes no further action. In fact, the command is simple. We read it, "Behold your wife, take her and go." In Hebrew, it's 4 words. Behold, wife, take, leave. Pharaoh is very short and to the point with Abraham. Though Abraham missed the death penalty, he is being expelled back into the land of famine. And then in verse 20, Pharaoh commanded his men concerning him, and they sent him away. So to ensure Abraham's departure, he is escorted out of Egypt, and his wife and all that he had. This is interesting. Pharaoh did not take back all those gifts he showered Abraham with. He allowed him to keep them. Now, Pharaoh certainly should have taken them back, but we see God's blessing here, that Abraham, though he sinned, was still God's people, was still blessed. And a little bit here, maybe Pharaoh feared more retribution from God if he took it back. To Pharaoh, what was important was that Abram, the offender, the liar, the person who caused him to commit adultery, was removed from the land altogether.